Something is shifting over America right now, and almost nobody watching the sky today has any idea what's about to hit them. While most of the country goes about a normal weekend, a pattern is locking into place overhead that meteorologists are already calling one of the strangest splits of the entire summer. On one side of the country, people are baking under warnings so severe that stepping outside for more than a few minutes could be dangerous. On the other side, the ground is about to become so saturated that entire neighborhoods could see water rising in places that have never flooded before. And sitting quietly in the Gulf, completely unnoticed by most of the country, is a wildcard that could scramble every single one of these forecasts within days. If you live anywhere between the Rockies and the Atlantic coast, what I'm about to walk you through could directly affect your week, your travel plans, or your safety. So stay with me, because this is not your typical summer weather update. This is a pattern that is genuinely catching forecasters off guard. And by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why. Before we get into the details, I want you to really sit with the scale of what's forming here. Because this isn't one storm system or one heat wave that fades out in a few days. This is a full continental scale pattern. The kind of setup meteorologists study for years afterward. The kind that ends up in textbooks because of how many different extremes it managed to pack into a single stretch of the calendar. And the reason it's flying under the radar for so many people right now is simple. Local weather apps show you your 10-day forecast for your zip code. They don't show you how your 10 days connect to what's happening 1,000 miles away. And they definitely don't show you how quickly that connection can change everything. That's exactly what we're going to fix over the next several minutes, piece by piece, region by region, until you can see the entire picture the way meteorologists are seeing it right now. And trust me, once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Let's start with what's happening on the ground right this moment, because the setup for everything that follows begins with a dome of heat that has parked itself over the middle of the country and simply refuses to move. Across the southern plains, through the deep south and stretching into the southeast, extreme heat warnings are active right now, not just heat advisories, but the kind of warnings the National Weather Service reserves for conditions that can genuinely hurt or kill people who aren't careful. A massive upper-level ridge has built over this region, acting like a lid clamped down over the atmosphere, trapping heat underneath it day after day with almost no relief in sight. Temperatures are running well above where they should be for mid-August. And because this ridge has been sitting in place for days already, the ground itself is baked hard and dry, which only makes the heat worse because dry soil heats up faster and holds that heat longer than moist ground would. This is the kind of setup that doesn't just make for an uncomfortable afternoon. It's the kind of setup that strains power grids as everyone cranks their air conditioning at the same time, stresses crops and livestock across agricultural regions, and turns any outdoor activity into a real risk, especially for anyone without easy access to shade, water, or air conditioning. But here's where it gets interesting, because while the south and central states are locked under that dome of heat, an entirely different story is unfolding just to the north. Along the northern tier of the country, the atmosphere is doing the exact opposite. Instead of a stagnant ridge trapping still, hot air, there's an active, energetic flow pushing through, and that flow is dragging round after round of rain and thunderstorms across the northern states. This isn't a one-and-done storm system passing through and clearing out. This is a repeating cycle, wave after wave of moisture riding along the boundary between that suffocating southern heat and the cooler, more turbulent air to the north. And when you get two dramatically different air masses sitting right next to each other like this, the boundary between them becomes a breeding ground for intense, sometimes dangerous weather. That boundary right now runs in a corridor stretching from the Midwest through the central Appalachians and out into the central high plains, and this is exactly where the second major threat is building. Forecasters are watching a serious flash flood risk develop along this entire stretch. And it's not a minor concern. When you combine repeated rounds of thunderstorms training over the same areas, with ground that, in some spots, is already saturated from previous rain, you get the exact recipe for flash flooding. The kind that can turn a quiet creek into a raging torrent in under an hour. The kind that catches drivers off guard on roads that flood without warning. If you live anywhere in that Midwest to Appalachian corridor, this is the part of the forecast you genuinely need to pay attention to over the coming days, because flash flooding is one of the most underestimated weather hazards there is, and it kills more people every year than most people realize. Now, if this were simply a matter of hot in the south and stormy in the north, that alone would be a notable pattern. But the reason this particular setup deserves your full attention is what happens next, because instead of breaking down and shifting into something new, this pattern is essentially frozen in place. Heading into the beginning of next week, the overall structure across the country is expected to remain remarkably unchanged. That ridge over the southern states isn't going anywhere. The active flow to the north isn't calming down. And that means the same story keeps repeating itself day after day, in almost the same locations, which is exactly the kind of scenario that turns a bad week of weather into something with real cumulative impact. There is, however, a subtle but important shift buried inside that unchanged big picture, and it's centered on the north-central United States. As we move into the beginning of next week, forecasters are highlighting a slight risk of excessive rainfall, specifically targeting the upper Midwest around the middle of next week. The mechanism here is what meteorologists call a shortwave. Essentially, a smaller disturbance riding along within that larger prevailing flow, and as it moves through, it's expected to trigger new rounds of convection, more thunderstorms, more downpours, concentrated on the northern edge of that stubborn ridge. The most notable area of concern sits right over the north-central states, where a shortwave moving through is expected to touch off isolated to scattered instances of flash flooding all over again. So if you thought the flooding threat we just talked about was a one-time event, think again, because the same ingredients are set to reload and fire off another round, just shifted slightly north and east from where the initial threat was centered. Let's zoom out for a second, though, because this isn't just a story playing out over a few days. There's a bigger monthly pattern developing underneath all of this, and it's arguably even more revealing about what's coming. Longer-range outlooks are pointing toward a significant shift in precipitation across the western half of the country, favoring a noticeably wetter stretch across the southwest, the Great Basin, and the Intermountain West, with that wetter signal extending eastward into the Great Plains. And this isn't just a marginal, slightly above average kind of forecast. In parts of Arizona, through most of Utah, into eastern Nevada and southeastern California, forecasters are putting the odds of significantly above normal precipitation above 50%. Think about that for a moment. Places that are normally bone dry in the middle of summer, places that define what we think of as desert climate, are looking at a real chance of substantial rain in the days ahead. That's the kind of anomaly that catches people off guard precisely because it goes against everything we expect from these regions in August. And it's not just isolated to the desert southwest. Odds are leaning toward above normal precipitation across most of the eastern half of the country as well, with only a narrow band of exceptions. The Florida Peninsula stands out as one of the few spots bucking that wetter trend, expected to see below normal rainfall, even as much of the rest of the country trends wetter than usual. Meanwhile, out toward the far reaches of the map, southeastern Alaska is leaning drier than normal too, while the rest of the southern and central parts of the state hover closer to their typical precipitation levels for this time of year. But strip away those exceptions, and the dominant story across nearly the entire lower 48 right now is a lean toward wetter conditions, layered right on top of that intense, ongoing heat in the central and southern states. Hot and wet at the same time isn't just uncomfortable. It's the exact combination that fuels the most explosive, fast-developing thunderstorm complexes. The kind that can produce damaging winds, torrential rainfall rates, and yes, flash flooding seemingly out of nowhere. Think for a second about what this means for daily life on the ground in the hardest hit areas. Extreme heat warnings aren't issued lightly. They're reserved for conditions where heat index values climb high enough that even healthy adults face real danger if they're outside for extended periods without water or shade. Emergency rooms in these regions tend to see a measurable rise in heat-related illness during stretches like this, and it's not just the obvious cases of heat stroke. It's dehydration. It's cardiac stress from the body working overtime to cool itself. It's outdoor workers, farmers, construction crews, delivery drivers, people who don't have the luxury of simply staying inside. Add in strain on regional power grids as air conditioning demand spikes across multiple states simultaneously. And you have a scenario where the heat itself becomes the story for days at a time, well before we even get to the flooding threat sitting just to the north. And that flooding threat deserves one more layer of explanation, because flash flooding is deceptive in a way that heat isn't. With heat, you can feel it building. Day after day, the warnings get more severe, everyone braces for it. But flash flooding can go from a light rain shower to a life-threatening wall of water moving down a normally dry creek bed in under 30 minutes. It's one of the leading causes of weather-related deaths every single year in this country, because so many people underestimate how quickly a few inches of fast-moving water can sweep a vehicle off a roadway. When forecasters talk about training thunderstorms, storm after storm moving over the exact same corridor, that's precisely the mechanism that turns a routine summer rainstorm into a genuine emergency, because the ground simply doesn't have time to absorb one round of rain before the next one arrives right on top of it. Now let's talk about the bigger monthly outlook, because this is where things start to look genuinely unusual for the rest of August. The broader seasonal forecast is calling for a month that, on the surface, sounds fairly typical for summer, a warmer than normal August across a large portion of the country. But dig one layer deeper and you find something much more interesting. A country that is essentially splitting into two opposing weather stories, running side by side for weeks at a time. Forecasters are painting a picture of major heat continuing to dominate the plains, while at the same time, a distinctly stormier pattern sets up and targets the northeast. That's right. While the middle of the country bakes under persistent high pressure, the northeast, a region that people don't typically associate with an unsettled, stormy August, is expected to trend cooler and wetter than average for a meaningful stretch of the month. This split has apparently already been setting up in recent weeks, and the expectation is that it continues right on into August without much interruption. Picture it as two completely different climates operating simultaneously under the same national flag, one baking, one soaked, separated by a boundary that keeps generating the kind of severe, flood-prone weather we've already talked about. For millions of Americans living across the plains and the Midwest, that means below-average rainfall is expected to continue, deepening dryness in a region that's already dealing with the consequences of a stalled, hot pattern. Meanwhile, in the Northeast, the exact opposite problem could be brewing. Too much rain, too many storms, and cooler temperatures that feel almost out of season compared to what people there are used to in the middle of summer. Layer the national temperature outlook on top of this regional split, and the picture becomes even more complicated. The strongest signal for above normal temperatures is centered squarely over the southeast, but that warm anomaly doesn't stop there. It stretches up through the mid-Atlantic and reaches into parts of the northeast as well, even as that same northeast region is expected to deal with a stormier, more active pattern. In other words, it's entirely possible for parts of the northeast to run both warmer than average and wetter than average at the same time, which is its own kind of unusual combination. The sticky, humid, storm-prone conditions that can make August feel almost tropical in places that rarely experience that kind of weather. Meanwhile, out on the West Coast, an entirely different heat story is unfolding. Much of California, Oregon, and Washington are trending warmer than average as well, layering yet another region into this growing patchwork of anomalies. And here's the piece that ties directly back to public safety, because this persistent West Coast warmth isn't just an inconvenience. Higher than normal temperatures across this stretch of the country tend to increase energy demand as everyone leans harder on cooling systems. They elevate wildfire concerns in regions that are already dry heading into the back half of summer. And they add extra stress onto agriculture and outdoor activity across a huge swath of the western United States. Which brings us to fire, because the heat and dryness setting up across parts of the West aren't just numbers on a temperature map. They translate directly into elevated fire danger heading into the rest of the month. Significant fire potential is running above normal across a large stretch of the northwestern United States, covering central Utah, northwest Colorado, western Wyoming, and northwest Montana, and extending all the way out to the Pacific Northwest coast and northeast California. That's an enormous footprint of elevated fire risk sitting right in the middle of peak wildfire season, and it doesn't stop there. Above normal fire potential is also forecast across much of the northern plains, northern Minnesota, the southern plains, the lower Mississippi Valley, South Florida, and even out into Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. That's fire risk spanning from the northern border almost down to the Caribbean, a reminder that this isn't a regional concern confined to one corner of the map. It's a nationwide pattern with nationwide consequences. And here's what makes the fire piece of this story especially dangerous. It's the timing. Fire season doesn't peak in a vacuum. It peaks after weeks of accumulated dryness, after vegetation that greened up earlier in the year has had time to cure out into dry, flammable fuel. A single lightning strike from one of those isolated thunderstorms we talked about earlier, the same storms bringing flash flood risk to one region, can just as easily spark a wildfire in a drier region a few hundred miles away. And once that fire starts, elevated winds associated with a strengthening pressure gradient can push it into something far larger within hours. Communities across the Intermountain West and Pacific Northwest have seen this exact sequence play out before. Dry fuels, a dry lightning event, and gusty winds, combining into a fast-moving fire that catches even experienced residents off guard because the conditions changed faster than anyone expected. Meanwhile, out on the East Coast, the drought picture is worth pausing on too, because it tells you just how uneven this summer has been. The most recent update to the National Drought Monitor shows areas of abnormally dry conditions scattered across parts of the country, even as other regions deal with flooding rainfall, which is exactly the kind of contradiction that defines this entire pattern. You can have drought monitors flagging dryness in one state while emergency managers, 2 states over, are worried about flash flooding, sometimes in the very same week. That's not a contradiction in the data. That's simply what a fractured, unstable summer pattern looks like when you zoom in close enough to see it region by region instead of glancing at a single national map. What's driving a lot of this, according to forecasters watching the bigger picture, is a summer that has been unusually progressive, meaning the weather hasn't settled into one steady state for long stretches. Instead, it's been swinging back and forth, Short bursts of hot, dry weather followed by cooler, wetter conditions, over and over again. That kind of choppy back and forth pattern makes it incredibly difficult to predict exactly how any single week will play out, because the atmosphere isn't locked into a predictable rhythm. It's lurching from one extreme to another. And that instability is a huge part of why this next stretch of weather has the potential to catch so many people off guard. It's not a slow, gradual shift you can see coming from a mile away. It's a pattern that can flip on short notice. And that brings us to the piece of this story that could upend everything we've just talked about, the wild card sitting quietly in the background that almost nobody's paying attention to yet, the tropics. August is widely regarded by meteorologists as one of the single hardest months of the entire year to forecast with confidence. And the reason comes down almost entirely to tropical systems. Even a modest tropical disturbance forming in the Gulf of Mexico or moving up from the Caribbean can completely rewrite a forecast within just a day or two. These systems don't just bring their own independent threat of wind and rain, they interact with everything already in place, pulling moisture northward, disrupting ridges, amplifying troughs, and in some cases dramatically altering rainfall patterns across huge sections of the country almost overnight. Forecasters have specifically flagged the Gulf Coast and the Southeast as the regions most vulnerable to this kind of sudden tropical-driven disruption precisely. The same regions that are already dealing with dangerous heat and elevated wildfire risk. If a tropical system does spin up and track into that region in the coming weeks, it wouldn't just be adding another weather story to an already crowded map. It could actively collide with and transform every pattern we've just described, turning extreme heat into extreme flooding in a matter of days, or steering moisture completely away from areas that desperately need relief from ongoing dryness. This is the part of the forecast that professional meteorologists watch most closely and talk about least publicly, because there's genuinely nothing concrete to report yet. There's no named storm, no clear track, no official watch or warning. But the ingredients for rapid tropical development are exactly the kind of thing that shows up quietly on long-range model runs, days before it ever becomes a headline. Warm ocean water in the Gulf, weak upper-level wind, shear at the wrong moment, and a disturbance riding in off the African coast or spinning up locally in the Caribbean. That combination can turn a nothing system into a serious threat in a remarkably short window. This is exactly why coastal residents from Texas through Florida and up into the Carolinas are always told to keep half an eye on the tropics all the way through the heart of hurricane season, because the lead time between calm skies and an active warning can sometimes be measured in just a couple of days. So when you step back and look at the entire picture together, what you're really looking at is a country stretched across several completely different weather realities, happening all at once, and none of them staying put for long. A dangerous, entrenched heat dome baking the central and southern states with warnings serious enough to threaten lives. An active, repeating storm track hammering the boundary just to the north with round after round of flash flood risk. A desert southwest that's suddenly flirting with a genuinely wet stretch that goes against everything typical for the season. A northeast trending both stormier and warmer at the same time. A strange combination that could bring humid, unsettled conditions many residents aren't expecting. A west coast running persistently warm, quietly building toward elevated fire danger across a massive stretch of terrain from the Rockies to the Pacific. And sitting underneath all of it, the ever-present unpredictable threat of the tropics, capable of reshuffling this entire deck with almost no warning. This is exactly the kind of setup where people get caught off guard. Not because the warning signs weren't there, but because the story is too split, too regional, too fast-changing for a quick glance at a weather app to capture. Someone in the southern plains sees extreme heat warnings and assumes that's the whole story for the country. Someone in the desert southwest has no reason to expect a soaking rain in August, so they don't prepare for it. Someone in the northeast expects a typical, mild August, and instead could be walking into a stretch of unusually active, stormy weather. And virtually nobody outside of meteorology circles is watching the Gulf closely enough to catch a tropical system before it's already reshaping the forecast in real time. And this is exactly why relying on a single app, a single number, or a single glance out the window is such a dangerous habit this time of year. The forecast for your exact location can look completely calm, even while the broader pattern feeding into it is anything but stable. A clear blue sky in the morning doesn't tell you that a shortwave is riding in from 3 states away, ready to fire off thunderstorms by mid-afternoon. A mild morning temperature doesn't tell you that a heat advisory is about to be upgraded by the time you're driving home from work. And absolutely nothing on a standard 7-day forecast is going to warn you 2 weeks in advance about a tropical system that hasn't even organized yet. That's the layer most people never see, and it's exactly the layer that ends up mattering most when a pattern like this one is in play. If there's one thing to take away from everything we've just covered, it's this. Don't assume the weather happening in your part of the country tells you anything about what's happening 2 states over, And don't assume that the pattern sitting overhead today is going to look anything like the pattern a week from now. This is a summer defined by extremes sitting right next to each other, heat next to floods, drought next to deluge, calm next to chaos, all separated by boundaries that can shift with very little notice. Stay aware of your local forecast in the coming days, especially if you're anywhere near that Midwest to Appalachian flood corridor, anywhere under those extreme heat warnings in the central and southern states, or anywhere along the Gulf Coast where a tropical system could turn everything on its head with almost no warning at all. The pattern is set, the ingredients are all in place, and the only real question left is exactly how and exactly where. It ends up catching people off guard first. Keep a close eye on official forecasts from your local weather service over the next several days, rather than a generic app icon, because the details on the ground can shift block by block when a pattern is this unstable. If you found this breakdown useful, it's worth checking back in as the week develops, because a pattern this unsettled rarely resolves quietly. More often than not, it builds towards something, and when it does, you'll want to already understand exactly how we got there.